Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. We'll let the stragglers come in as they may. Hope they don't get picked off by the rabid wolves outside. Welcome to us. We've got a guest lecturer today, Stephen Johnson, who is, what's your title now? It's the editorial director for Google NotebookLM. So we've talked a little bit about using large language models in the class for various things. And we had Peter talking about coding with AI. So Stephen's going to talk about writing with AI. And I think I first met you when Roland came and gave a talk. And we've done a few talks together. And it's always been great fun. So I'm glad we got you to come back. So let's see here. I want to start with our AI news of the day. So for Marco and for Stephen, what we do is since the landscape is changing moment by moment, we try to do a little blurb every day. And so we pick out a couple of news items that are relevant to the class. And this one struck me from last week. This was Anthropic having a report about some state actor using their large language model, their Anthropic, to build an agent-based infrastructure security attack system. You knew this was coming. This is completely predictable. As sure as the sun rises in the morning, it was going to happen. But they were the first to both report on it and to be able to document how people are using it. So, it's now out there. Guess what? Everybody else is going to start following suit. So, no agent-based system is free from the threat of being used to compromise your favorite state system or whatever. Interestingly, this guy you might have heard of, Linus Torvalds, is okay with vibe coding. So Peter found this article from today, talks about it's great to use vibe coding for fun stuff. You want security? Don't be that guy. And we've talked before in class about the problems of getting really accurate, high quality code out of a vibe coding system. So remember Peter's analysis of that one piece of code where he commented all over it. It was like the red ink pen threw up on the code. Remember that? So Linus thinks this, so we probably should take heed of that. I also found this article by Alexios. Yeah. So he was in Google News a while ago, and he's now off doing something else, including running this newsletter called Indicator. He points out that bots are writing prose in response to posts on X. So community notes is now dominated by AI chatbots, basically. And so what would you predict would happen? A, bots are going to dominate the numbers of threads, numbers of comments posted. The next couple of posters are humans, but look at the numbers. It's a factor of 5, 6, 7. Prediction, that number will increase. Okay. Now, we talked earlier about how bots are writing like sports stories and other stories in news, and now you can't really tell if your favorite football story is bot written or human written unless it's a byline. But even so, you have to look up the byline to figure out that Zesty Walnut Crackle is not a human. Okay, so but that'll be our last slide for today. So with that as an intro, that's our news for the day. Let me introduce Stephen Johnson, who's written more books than I've written papers, and or it feels that way. And they're books that I have really read and enjoyed, and I've recommended them to people. I just recently sent Ghost Map to some folks because the Ghost Map was a InfoViz, from my perspective, it's an InfoViz story. From your perspective, it's probably something else. But it's really, these are all great stories about popularization stories about technology and science and how these different things we invent change our lives in fundamental ways, right? Most recent book is called The Infernal Machine, right? About what I call it, history of dynamite, which I love as a phrase because you don't think of dynamite as having a social history, but Stephen's book points it out in a really interesting way. So let me give the floor to you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Dan. It's such an honor to be in this class with Dan and with Peter, two heroes of mine. Let me just switch over to my slides here. Done something else on talk. Yeah, great. Okay. Good. Yeah, those are some of the books. I think this was a few books ago, but so Infernal Machine isn't on there. But yeah, this is kind of my background. So, I actually, Dan, the first time we met, actually appropriately, is that you emailed me to see if I would talk at this class 3 years ago because I'd written the Times piece, and which I'm going to talk about, and I was like, well, I have some news for you. I'm actually like a new employee at Google, and so it's been a great friendship ever since. So here's what I was thinking we'd do this morning. I was going to talk a little bit about the journey that I went on from being a kind of professional author to co-founding and developing NotebookLM. And just talk about the kind of my intellectual journey that led to that, which is really about how I thought about technology and how I thought about tools for thought that augmented my thinking and my research, and then talk about like what happened once I arrived at Google. I'll actually show you some old screen grabs and video of the original iterations of Notebook as we developed it, including the one that you saw in the fall of 2022, just to talk about the way we were thinking about the product and how it related to the writer and researcher and journalist kind of workflow, which is only part of what the product is designed to do. And then I would just kind of jump into NotebookLM today and show you how I'm using it as an author and why I think it is really a significant advance. And we can start to talk about like what this means in terms of authorship and creativity and working with AI as a collaborator and not necessarily just a straight tool. And then open it up for conversation questions. So that's kind of the journey I go on this morning. So my journey into all this really dates back to sophomore year of college for me, which was in the distant past of 1987. And Apple released this now kind of obscure, but at the time deeply influential program called HyperCard. No one has heard of HyperCard in this room, right? Besides the old timers, right? Yes. Okay, good. So HyperCard was actually the second creation, big creation by a guy named Bill Atkinson, who just passed away, who was the original interface designer for the Mac operating system. And this was kind of his baby after the release of the Mac. And it was kind of a knowledge management tool. It had a bit of a kind of a language of hypertext. This is like 6 or 7 years before the web really became mainstream. So hypertext was not a word that people knew about at all. But basically there was this idea that you could create these stacks of information, like cards of information. You could control what they look like, and you could control the way that they link to each other. And so you could build a kind of knowledge base. There was a kind of lightweight scripting language that was called HyperTalk, I think it was. Yeah. And so I saw this application as a sophomore in college, and I thought, oh man, I could use this to organize my notes for my class. I could build a tool that would allow me to manage all this information. I'm going from class to class. I'm trying to keep track of it all. If software could actually help me keep track of everything I was doing and make new connections and write better papers, this would be fantastic. And so I built a little application inside of HyperCard called Curriculum. And I kind of was one of those things where I got so obsessed with building this tool that I stopped going to the classes that I was supposed to be attending to like take notes for. But I ended about a year, and HyperCard itself never really like took off as a platform. It influenced a lot of people who then went on to build things like the World Wide Web. But it gave me this taste of what was possible when you were working in a sense in a kind of collaborative mode with the software, where the software is helping you really organizing your ideas. It wasn't just a simple tool like a word processor where you were just writing things down and formatting them. It was somehow more embedded in the actual like intellectual work that I was doing in the classes that I was taking. And so it planted this seed. And actually one of the things that I've noticed over the years writing about technology and innovation is that this is like a common pattern where people get a taste of possibility with the technology that's like a little bit ahead of its time, but somehow has a promise of something that's coming. That seems to happen a lot, and that it's folks who kind of keep those seeds and the possibility alive in their minds for long periods of time that end up doing really breakthrough things, because sometimes you get a glimpse of something that's maybe like 5 or 10 years ahead of its time, and if you can just keep that alive when its time comes, you're able to really capitalize on it. And HyperCard was a bit like that with the web, right? The web, I got a taste of what hypertext could be like, and it drove me in that direction. So I kind of kept this obsession with tools for thought alive for a long period of time, and over the years, I would use all the new kind of mind mapping, note-taking tools that would come along. Obviously, when Google came out, that changed everything. When Google Scholar came out, that was revolutionary for me as a researcher. I started using this program called DevonThink in the early 2000s, where I basically was collecting all of my quotes from books that I had read as part of my research. And so whenever I would read a book, I would highlight passages. In the old days, if I was reading a print book, I would literally type passages when I was done reading, so I had a digital copy of those passages. As we moved to ebooks, I could highlight passages and store them automatically, which made it a lot easier. But I basically kept this really extensive collection of quotes that I used as research for the books that I was writing, so that I could search them, so that I could organize them, so that I could make connections more easily with all that information. And this software, DevonThink, let me actually did this kind of early form of kind of semantic analysis. So you could write a paragraph and then say, show me the other quotes from my collection that are semantically similar to this particular quote that I'm writing. And so I could be like, oh, I'm in the middle of writing I use this a lot when I was writing Ghost Map, which is a book about, 19th century solution to the problem of cholera. It's set in London, and there's a lot of stuff about mapping, as Dan was saying. And so I could write a section about the urban history of disease in London, and then I could go to DevonThink and say, do I have anything in my research materials that's related to this? And it would pull up related passages, which seemed magical at the time. I wasn't doing specific keyword searches. I wasn't just saying Command F cholera, and it would show me all the times cholera was mentioned. I could do more subtle things, like show me things that are like this block of text. And that's absolutely commonplace now in the age of AI, but 2005, it was pretty magical. And so I ended up writing about the tools that I was using over this period. I'd write about them for the New York Times, or I'd write about them at Medium or my blog. And then I wrote about them kind of extensively in this book I wrote in 2010 called Where Good Ideas Come From. So I was talking both about how people are creative and they're innovative in physical spaces, but I was also talking about how people are creative and innovative using software. And so kind of like a side hustle as a writer who would write about the tools he was using to write. And that became kind of a bit of part of my identity out there in the world. So that continued for a while. And then in late 2021, I came up with this idea to write a piece about this kind of little known organization in San Francisco called OpenAI. And OpenAI had just released GPT-3. This is like a year and a half before ChatGPT launched. And GPT-3, you may have covered this, I don't know, in the class, but GPT-3 was kind of the first language model that really started to show serious promise, where people were like, there's something here that seems really, really exciting. Google at the time had 2 language models that were also very promising, but interestingly, Google chose to not make them public. And so OpenAI, which was giving limited access to GPT-3, but more than Google was giving to its own models, was sharing this GPT-3, and it was quite interesting. It was not a chat, proper chat. You would just type something, and it could kind of basically continue whatever you started to type for paragraphs at a time. So it was like super fancy autocomplete in a way. But I had heard this thing about OpenAI, that it had this very interesting organizational structure where it was kind of half a nonprofit and half a for-profit. And I was like, well, people have heard about this GPT-3 thing, so I'm not going to write so much about that, but I think people don't know about this like hybrid model of for-profit, nonprofit, which ended up being a critical part of their story because it kind of blew up in their faces a couple years ago. So I pitched my editors at the Times Magazine and said, I want to write a piece about this org structure at OpenAI, and they said, okay. And so then in October of 2021, I got this night vividly, I was like sitting in my study and I got access to GPT-3 for the first time. And I sat down and started playing with it. And I just sat on my computer for 2 straight hours and I was like, oh my God, I have totally underestimated how important this shift is. Everything is going to change. This is the most important thing that has happened to software probably in my lifetime, certainly as big as the web. And I kind of went back to my editors and I said, forget my pitch about like the org structure of OpenAI. Like I want to write about what it means that computers are mastering language. Like this is a momentous change in how we interact with computers. We can finally talk to them in true natural language and they can talk back to us. And yes, it hallucinates. And yes, there are all these problems with it. And yes, there are safety issues. And yes, it's very erratic. But this is the beginning of something profound, and we should take it seriously and not treat it like it's some kind of illusion. And so I wrote a 10,000 word piece for the Times Magazine that came April of 2022, 8 months before ChatGPT. And this piece was the most controversial piece I've ever written in my life. I mean, I got so much hate on social media for arguing that language models were a significant change in how software operated and we needed to take them seriously. Like people were just like, oh, Johnson fell for the hype. He's so naive. Like, this is ridiculous. That's so sad to see someone who's just so confused. So it was extremely I'm very proud of this piece, but I did not enjoy the release of it at all because just getting slagged on social media is not fun, as some of you probably know. So it was very unpleasant, but 2 lovely things happened because of it. One of them is that Dan Russell emailed me and said, hey, would you like to come to my class, and began a lovely friendship because he and Peter had read the piece and they were going to teach it in the fall. But the other thing that happened was that there were 2 people at Google, a guy named Clay Bavor, who had founded a new area at Google, kind of revived an area at Google called Google Labs. He's since left. And another guy who was working for him named Josh Woodward, who is now the head of Google Labs and also the head of Gemini, the Gemini app. And Clay and Josh had been reading my writings over the years, and they knew about my obsession with tools for thought, and they knew about, they read this piece times, and they emailed me kind of out of the blue and they said, hey, we've got a crazy proposition for you. We know you've been dreaming of this ideal research assistant since you were in college. We think, as you can obviously tell, we think you think as well from reading your article, that language models are going to give you the opportunity to finally build that thing that you've been chasing forever. What would you say if you came to Google part-time and we an engineer and a designer and a kind of prototyper, and you just tried to build this thing you've always wanted? Would you be interested in that? And because I'm not an idiot, I was like, yes, I would very much like to do that. And so I joined part-time initially. That didn't last very long. In late July of 2022, and basically that kind of collaboration ultimately led to where we are today, 3.5 years later. NotebookLM, now one of Google's kind of flagship AI products, being used by more than 10 million people around the world, and it's been an amazing journey. It's been really, really cool. So I think all of you have used it a little bit, but I want to just talk a little bit about what our vision for it was, and then I'll take you through a couple of these slides that are kind of fun to show you what it actually looked like in the early days. But the core idea at the very center, from the beginning, from the first days that I was at Google, is what we came to call source grounding. So at that point in 2022, the only way you could really interact with a model was to just talk to a general purpose model that had been trained on all of the internet or whatever its overall training data was. And so you could have these interesting general purpose conversations. And it was magical for all the reasons that were ultimately magical. ChatGPT came out, But the model didn't know anything really about you. It didn't know the project that you were working on. It didn't know the book that you were trying to write. It didn't know the readings you were trying to do for your class. Like, it was a very, it didn't have any kind of specialized knowledge. And it was just, particularly in those days, it was radically prone to just make things up. You could just be like, hey, give me a bio of the 18th century chemist and just make up a name. And it would be like, sure, here's the bio. Like, it would never say anybody named that. I can't answer that question. So they were very vulnerable to hallucination. They were very unreliable. And so when I got to Google, there was a guy named Adam Bignell, who was kind of a founder of Notebook, who was working on a project called Talk to a Small Corpus. This is not Talk to a Small Corpse, which would be totally different. This is Talk to a Small Corpus, like a body of text. And the idea was that you would show some text, like an article, and say, hey, kind of in a sense, read this, and then answer all your questions based on the information in that text. And that was possible because the models, as I'm sure you've discussed, have something called a context window, which is kind of the amount of information you can put in that's kind of like the short-term memory of the model. You can put information in there and you can say, do things with this information in the context. Now, in those days, the context window was roughly like 2,000 words. So you couldn't put a lot in there, but put context with information, and then you could say, answer questions based on this information. And so Adam was working on this little prototype that did this. And so I got a little, again, this like echo of this obsession from my whole career of like, well, what if I could put my reading quotes into the model's context, so that just like I had done with DevonThink, I could have the model kind of remember the things that I'd read as research for this particular article that I was writing, or the lecture that I was preparing, or this book that I was working on. And the model not only would be able to make associations like DevonThink could do, but the model would actually be able to answer questions like factually, and I could query it and get suggestions for things, or I could just fact check a piece because the model was reading, in a sense, the same things that I was reading. And so that was the very kind of core of the product from the very beginning, was that we were going to not just do a general purpose model, we were going to do a model that was source grounded. Since that point, almost all the models now allow you to upload documents and work with those documents. But Notebook is the only product that's really, the whole design of it is organized around that kind of structure, or way of working, that workflow. And it's a particularly valuable workflow. It's valuable for kind of all knowledge work, but it's a particularly valuable workflow for writers, for researchers, for students, for academics, for scholars, because so much of those jobs around kind of synthesizing information that is scattered across many, many documents. So when you're writing a final paper for a class, you're drawing on information from all the reading that you've done over the course of the class. You're drawing from the independent research you've done to support the paper. So that might be like 30, 45 different PDFs or books that you're working on, or your own notes from the class lectures. And so that work, it turns out to be a very common workflow for all kinds of knowledge. Like if you're a lawyer, you're constantly thinking, okay, I've got all these deposition transcripts that I have to work with and turn into a brief that I'm going to file. If you're a marketing director, you're trying to take all this information about the audience that you're trying to speak to and the product information and how it's changing, and synthesize that into the campaign text that you're going to use. So it's a recurring pattern that we see again and again that happened to overlap with my own kind of needs as an author and as a journalist. And so we built Notebook to kind of accommodate that from the very beginning. So I want to show you a couple of things about how the product evolved. This is kind of fun. Let me just switch tabs here real quick. So this is, where is it? Oh, maybe I've lost it actually. Hold on, I gotta find it again. 1 second. Videos. Boom. Dylan full history. Okay, so yeah.
Switch your presentation to this.
Oh, I did I not? Oh, share this tab instead. Yes, good catch. Okay. Did it switch? Yeah, I'll stop sharing. Okay, let me switch back. Switch out of here. Go back to here. Yeah. Yeah, it's a drive. There we go. Okay. So make this full screen. Okay, does that look good?
You still need to share that. Oh, you need to share your whole screen.
Oh,
Just share a whole screen.
okay.
Sorry.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yep.
There you go.
Okay, and then I just go over here. That is working.
Now we're good.
Okay, good. So this is the very first. So Dan, I showed this to Dan when I kind of in the fall of putting. Like this is the first idea we had. So this is an example. Like you have this kind of like note-taking area here, and you could have these little quotes that would show up on the side that were kind of summarized. And so it was very similar to my Devon Think thing, but I could like write some text and it would bring up kind of links to quotes on the right-hand side. So that was very exciting. And you could kind of scroll through them and actually like see the original quote if you wanted to dive in. Then we had this stuff that was really new at the time where you could, this has become commonplace, but this is kind of the first place that anybody had done it, where you could select the text and then you could apply AI transformations on it. So you could simplify the text or you could add bullet points. My favorite one that we built that I don't think anybody's built yet is we had another plugin there called Contrarian. And so whatever you did, whatever you wrote, if you click Contrarian, the model would offer the counter argument against what you'd written. Always find, so it would basically be devil's advocate. It would play like the contrarian and critique whatever you'd written or offer some kind of counter argument. So it was a way of like kind of challenging your ideas as you were writing. So we did a bunch of experiments like that. This is all internal prototypes we built. Like none of this actually ever shipped. This is another internal prototype we had. We were kind of like your sources in your left-hand side, and maybe there's some kind of chat on the right-hand side, and then there's a document, and then we started thinking about like these note cards. And you have this kind of center chat, which is kind of what eventually evolved there. Then somehow they made us make it green. I don't know if you can see how like this is a bright lime green because they didn't want it to look like docs. They were afraid. And so this is actually what we first shipped as a like trusted tester thing. Then we switched over to something a little bit closer to what the product looked like. We had this idea of like notes that you would pin up on the note board kind of behind the chat, which we ended up dropping in a slightly different way, and you had your sources on the left-hand side. So this is kind of like, this is basically over about a year of just kind of messing around, partially in public, and then until we got to basically, and I'll switch over now to the real thing. Hold on one second.
While you're doing that,
yeah.
Comment. One of the points of this class is shown in what Stephen just showed, which is the UI for these AI systems is really not obvious. There's huge design space, as he was just showing you. And where do the notes go? Where do the references go? How should the citations work? How should the switching go? Where do you pay attention? So this is the design evolution of AI systems. And this is true for all of the systems we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think to build on that, Dan, like, one of the things that we were trying to do, and I think one of the reasons why we were able to take such a small team and turn it into a real shipping product that's a big part of Google's AI strategy now, is we were trying to build something from the ground up that was a new UI designed with the knowledge that there was going to be AI at the center of it at every point, right? So on the one hand, you can do things like adding AI features to an existing kind of category like a word processor, and that's great. Important thing to do, like, you know, Microsoft Word and Docs are doing that, and that's great. But every time you have a new transformative technology like this, just as we saw with the web, which required us to invent something called a web browser, when you have something as transformative as a language model, new software archetypes are going to become possible and are going to become necessary. And so we were like, if you were just starting from scratch with no preconceptions, what would you want it to look like? How would you want it to work? And so after a lot of tinkering, we ended up coming up with this basic UI, which, you know, no doubt will change, but there's some fundamental things that we're very proud of here that take a little bit of learning. Like, it's not obvious to people. Like, I think our onboarding process is somewhat user hostile, I would say, still. We need to get better at kind of teaching people how to use it. But once you figure it out, it's pretty remarkable. So the core idea is basically you have these 3 panels. And the left-hand panel is that classic thing that you kind of like there from the kind of last iteration of the product. This is where you organize all your sources. And so what has happened since those original prototypes is that the context window for the model has gone from being like 2,000 words to being right now in NotebookLM 1 million words, more or less, 800,000 words, more or less. And we're able to actually, using things like RAG, which I'm sure you've talked about, to actually get in front of the model the most relevant path from up to about 50 million words of text. So you can have in your sources, just in one notebook, 50 million words or images or video or audio, all these different things that you can put into the context of the model to help you do whatever you're working on. And this has, in a sense, enabled me to finally kind of realize that kind of quest that I was on with my reading notes. So this is a notebook I have, which is called Everything. It's my Everything notebook. And in the Everything notebook is the full text of most of my books. So you can see there, if you can read it, it says Emergence, Enemy of All Mankind, Extra Life, Farsighted. So I think I have like 8 or 9 of the books in here. So right there, that's something like 600,000 words of text. And I have all of my reading quotes. So these are my collections of quotes from books that I've read. And it's there are something like 9,000 quotes in here from books that I've read. So this is like from 25 years of me reading. These are the 9,000 quotes that were the most important to me in my thinking and my evolution as a writer, as a thinker, as an intellectual. So in a sense, like, this captures, like, between my own writing and my own reading, like, the core ideas that make me who I am on some level. And they're all now in one notebook, all accessible in this extraordinary way. And one of the things that's really important about the here is that, and this is another way in which Notebook is different from almost every other product out there, is that you can read the original source in Notebook itself. So, you know, you can, upload sources, or you can do deep research or something like that, and you'll get a nice report, and it will point to a bunch of those sources. But if you want to read them, you have to open them up in another tab. You're not really interacting with them in the actual product. We wanted to make this product so that it is entirely oriented around the original documents, the original, like, authored documents that are central to your whatever job you're working on. And so that was a really important kind of design principle. And it turns out that if you look at actually the way that people are actually using Notebook, in terms of the features that are used, the #1 feature, which I'll show you in a second, is just basically chat with your sources. The second most used feature is just opening the source viewer panel to read the original source. We have all these other magical features like audio reviews and all these other things, but actually, like, just being able to get access to the material and have all your sources all nicely organized in one place so you can quickly consult them or read them or grab a quote from them. That turns out to be, like, no AI is involved in, like, having that source reader there, but people use it all the time because the basic strategy of having all your documents in one place is really just useful for this kind of workflow. So that's the, like, left-hand panel. In the center panel, we have chat. I'm just going to ask a suggested question here. Connected environmental and diverse perspectives drive emergent innovation and societal transformation. This is a kind of big think question. Yeah.
Sorry. You might have mentioned this before when you're describing how NotebookLM works, but it's clear that there's a focus on in the design on fidelity to the original sources. Just from the modeler out of the more effectively than
Yes, it's a great question. We believe, and we've done some work on this, but we should do more. we believe it is better than just straight ChatGPT at that. Gemini is particularly good at source grounding. We helped the Gemini team in the early days with precisely this use case. So they did a lot of training on like fidelity to the original source material. But the one way in which it is just kind of like fundamentally different is, so this is the answer that we got back. I'm gonna just blow this up just a little bit more so you can see it maybe a little bit.
Where the question is that came from?
Yeah, so there are always these suggested questions down at the bottom that are based on the source material. So you can just kind of click on something, and increasingly they should be based on the conversation history that you just had. We're making a change to that right now. So I just asked this question about environments and diverse perspectives and how they drive emergent behavior. And so I get this answer from the model. And it's like this long, detailed answer that's going through all of my sources across all of my reading history to come up with this like kind of amazing answer. But the really important thing here is that there are citations. Everywhere the model says a kind of statement of fact, you see these little citations here. And when you hover over them, you get the original quote that the model used to come up with that answer. And so that's the thing that, you know, all the other models will give you citations saying, hey, I got this answer from this paper or from this source, but they won't do that kind of paragraph level citations. As far as I know, I haven't seen anybody else do this yet. And also because of the way we've designed it, if you want to dive deeper, you just click on the citation and it takes you directly to that passage in the source material. So you're able to actually like navigate through just the speed of, like in a way, we've talked about this, Dan, this is like a search innovation in a way. The ability to go from like, here's an abstract question, give me an answer. Oh yes, in the 3 million words of text here, what is the paragraph that is most relevant to this answer you've just given me? And then be able to hop directly to that at that speed, like in a matter of like a second or two. And that interaction from citation to passage would be exactly as fast if I had 50 million words in here. That part of it isn't affected by like the overall amount of volume. To answer your question, like, we believe that the underlying model and the way that we have instructed it to kind of like in system instructions to like stick to the facts is better at factuality and source groundedness on its own than ChatGPT. But we also believe that the interface that we built around this allows the user to fact check themselves and feel confident that this is the right answer and stuff like that. So, and I'll show you this. I use the citations in like all sorts of ways. But so then finally, here in the center, so this is where you like have the conversation, and then we have this like incredibly fun new as of like a year ago, the studio panel on the right hand side, and that is where you can take your sources and transform them into other formats. And this is the thing that we kind of got famous for, because last year in September we released this feature called Audio Overviews, which some of you have probably heard, which turns your sources into a simulated AI podcast to people. And we've since that thing went viral like nothing I've ever been involved with in my life. They had a whole skit about us on Saturday Night Live, making fun of us, which is the sign that you really finally made it when they're making fun of you on SNL, with Timothy Chalamet as one of the people in the skit. It was pretty funny. And so we've really expanded the studio panel a lot over the last, so now we have audio overviews, we have video overviews, we have mind maps, which are amazing, flashcards, quizzes, and in a couple of days we're going to have 2 new ones called infographics and slides, which were kind of amazing. And actually I'll show you very quickly. This is an infographic that I made for my book Infernal Machine that Dan referenced. I gave it the custom instruction to like create an infographic representing the plot of this as a map of New York City in the old time style of like a news teens or something like that, because it's set in the beginning of the 20th century. So this is what it came up with. Oh, it's not loading because maybe I'm offline. Shoot. I don't think so. Okay. Imagine a really beautiful infographic. Try it again. This is. Yeah, that's weird.
So, you know, with the magic of video editing, if you send me the infographic, I'll edit it.
Yeah, you know, I think it's probably like, hey, we haven't announced this until Thursday, so it's not letting me do it. So I can show you, let me show you an example also from, let me switch tabs here. So one of the things that we're really interested in doing is, which my colleague Marco is here has been helping, is we're interested in Notebook not just as a, not good, not just as a personal productivity tool for your own research, but also as a way of publishing research and publishing ideas. So when I write my next book, I'm hoping to publish it in notebook format, as well as in ebook format and audiobook format, so that you can do all these amazing things and transformations. You can ask questions, you can do quizzes, all these different ways you can interact with it. We started publishing these featured notebooks on the front door of NotebookLM, although depending on what kind of account you have, you might not see them. And this is one where we work with Google Research, and we basically spent a lot of time collecting the latest research on a given topic, like genomics, and putting all those articles into a single notebook. And that way scholars can go in and have access to that information and ask very high-level questions, or just an ordinary person who's interested in genomics and their health can come in and ask for a kind of lower level, or they can do things like watch a video overview and listen to a video overview. So this,
right? Your DNA has 3 billion letters in.
I gotta do. If it takes over the screen, is it not going to work? Okay, I'm just going to show
You know,
it.
it's pretty wild to think about, right? Your DNA has 3 billion letters in its code, and a single typo, just one, could be the difference between health and a serious disease. So today, we're going to dive into how AI is giving us these incredible new tools to finally read that code and find the clues hidden inside.
Okay, so that really is the $1,000,000 question.
So it's
We've got this
generating
massive book of life, our genome, and a tiny little change in one letter could be linked to something like glaucoma or a heart condition. But how in the world do you find that one specific needle?
Kind of like a 12-minute lecture with slides and with illustrations. You see, if I kind of click through it, you can see some of the
go-to tool for this hunt has been something called a genome-wide. To deal with this messiness, researchers came up with a really smart AI called Deep Knowledge.
Out of the source material.
But that just reveals the next big problem. What happens when the label?
So it's basically like an on-demand kind of lecture. And again, you can customize this. So you can load up all your assignments for your class, and then you can say, okay, I'm really trying to focus on, I'm taking this American history class, and I really want to focus on the impact of Sputnik on the American technology sector. Create a video overview, diving deep into that, and then you can watch that, or you can create an audio overview you can listen to. So the idea is that knowledge inside the notebook is very fluid, and it can be transformed into whatever format you actually find interesting, or that engages you, or that makes sense for listening to at the gym or while you're driving somewhere. Or it can be adjusted to your comprehension levels. This is why it's such a powerful kind of learning tool too. So you could say, hey, I'm a 10th grader in high school. I've loaded in all these very complicated papers, but please, in our chat or in this video overview, please target it to a student in 10th grade so that I can understand the material and make sense of it. I want to engage with it, but I can't just read the original sources in the original formats because they're too complicated. So that's the kind of the way to think about the UI that we ended up coming up with, to Dan's point, is the left panel is inputs and context management. The center is conversation, and the right side is outputs. How do you take that information and turn it into other formats that then you could share or engage with or consume? Yeah.
I'm wondering, when you think about people sort of trying to immortalize themselves maybe through this, because it seems like maybe the old head kind of AI users a few years back would be like, well, I want to download my consciousness onto this thing. It seems like I could do that, and maybe I'll be able to talk, or my great grandkids will be able to talk to me for all eternity. And it seems like that maybe isn't your goal, but you choose something of the sort with how you would respond to a bunch of different questions. And the model also seems to think that it's doing maybe something similar, and it says, we've come up with all this work. Great question, Stephen. This is what our sources say. Is that something in the kind of implications of the work that you guys are dealing with? And do you think that's some or somewhat?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I mean, a lot of different themes to that. So one thing I would say that has always been kind of thrilling about doing kind of an open-ended software project like this with the new platform, like a language model, is you get all these use cases that your users end up kind of discovering that you hadn't thought about in designing the product. Like, so one unrelated to your question, one that I love is like, no, it's a huge hit with like role-playing game people, like Dungeons and Dragons players, right? So it's like, it's really useful if you're the dungeon master of your D&D campaign to have all the campaign information and the manuals in a notebook so you can quickly access it and help build your campaign. It was not part of our plan at all, but it turns out to be great for D&D, right? But another one, which is fascinating with audio overviews, is people started putting their journals into NotebookLM. And we are, like, I should point out, a really important principle here, we are not training the model on your information, right? The context window of the model, and when you close your session, it's out of the context window. So if you put in your private diaries here, you will not become part of Gemini's general knowledge, and no one else will, be able to access that information. So because of that, people were like, oh, great, I've been like writing my journals. You can actually do it by hand. If you write it by hand and you scan the images, like Gemini reads handwriting, so you could actually do it with the handwritten journal. But if you have them in digital form, you load them in here, and then people were making audio overviews, journal entries. And it turned out to be really fascinating to listen to these two AI podcast hosts discussing your like month. They'd be like, Stephen had a pretty rough, November. It started out pretty tough, but then, he had that fun visit to Stanford. That was great. And they would have these whole conversations. And somehow, I don't keep personal journals. I have my like reading quotes, just kind of my version of it. But somehow it was really fascinating for people to hear this kind of perspective on their own personal lives. So as a tool for kind of just capturing where your head has been and being able to revisit that or remember things or see patterns that you might not have otherwise seen, it's really valuable. And I think that kind of use of it is great. We fully encourage that. What you're getting to then is like, is there some version of this where then you could instruct the model to pretend to be that person? And if, say, that person is your ex-girlfriend who breaks up with you and is no longer in your life, or someone who dies, is it a way of somehow keeping them alive? And you can kind of structure the prompt to the model to say, like, pretend to be my ex-girlfriend or pretend to be my lost husband. It's possible. And I know people are using it in that way. People are definitely using it to kind of simulate people. There's educational uses of that where you could be like, I want you to simulate being, Charles Darwin, and here's all of Charles Darwin's work, and I want to interact with this model who's simulating Darwin, and that feels like a fantastic way to bring someone back from the dead. What it means in more complex emotional spaces is, I think we're just starting to wrestle with that as a society. We generally instruct the model to not take on the voice of people in the sources. So the way the model is instructed in the system prompt is basically be a guide to these sources. Don't pretend to be the author of the sources, but you can customize the chat mode and you can change that around. So it's possible to change it. Yes, go back there.
I'm curious how you as a creator balance kind of guiding and directing users to think a certain thing versus following what they might have come up with themselves.
As someone creating notebook. Oh yeah. So we spend a lot of time trying to figure out like what the right balance is. Like, so for instance, one key area, which in a sense we've been debating since the early days of the product, is Notebook is very rigorous about not citing information from outside the sources. So if I go into my like everything notebook that has all these quotes and I say like list the 10 Taylor Swift albums, it will be like, I can't answer that question, Stephen, because there's nothing about Taylor Swift in the sources. And yet Gemini knows like a lot of information about Taylor Swift. And so it's deliberately like withholding that information from me because we are prioritizing source grounding. I think I've always argued a little bit on the team. I've been on the side of like, maybe we should open it up a little bit. There are some times where you might want to be able to just ask a quick factual question. And, as long as the model says, this is based on my general knowledge, but here's the answer to your question. Like that feels like an appropriate kind of leash to give the model. But to date, we've largely kept, I keep losing that argument, basically. So, but we spent a lot of time thinking about that, like how much freedom should the user have to steer away from those sources if they specifically ask for that. We've added recently I'm going to switch back. I'm going to switch to another notebook here and just talk a little bit about my writing process. Continue to have questions too as we do this. We have added deep research, which is really fascinating and an amazing tool. I'm sure a bunch of you are using it with both OpenAI as a version and Gemini as a version. So we've now added deep research to the source panel. And so what we decided to do for users who wanted to get more information is give them a quick, easy sources and bring them into NotebookLM. And what's amazing, and we just rolled this out like a couple of days ago, it's like brand new. So what's great about deep research in Notebook compared to all the other implementations is you can ask a complicated research question, you get a long report documenting everything it's found, but you also get the sources. And so you can go through and say, oh, I want that source, I want that source, I want all of them, bring them all into my notebook. And that means that it's a knowledge base that goes beyond just that report. You can select a couple of them and generate an audio overview based on them and so on. So that's the one example of how we think about like what the user might want to do and how to accommodate them and give them some freedom and flexibility, but it's a constant debate. Let me show you just quickly. So just talking about my practice as a writer. So I'm thinking about pretty much committed to writing a book, my kind of take on the California Gold Rush, 1849. And I have a particular story that I've stumbled across about the clash between the Gold Rush kind of white settlers and the Native American tribes that were living in the Yosemite Valley, and the Mariposa conflict that happened in like 1850, 1851, 1852. And so for the past 6-8 months, I've been kind of researching this, and I've created this notebook now called the Gold Rush book. And in that notebook, I have things. I have all of my kind of a bunch of articles, a bunch of quotes from books that I've read. I've also been, and this is a really important part of Notebook that I think is underappreciated, I also have a lot of notes that I've taken. You can just create a traditional note in Notebook and just write things down. And you can save anything that's interesting in your conversations with the model too. So I'm constantly having these conversations, and the model says something really interesting, and I can save it. I can save it with all the citations so that I can get to the passages that I want. And so this has become like my thinking space for this book. So when I go down and I'm like, how could I structure, like, what would the chapter structure be potentially? I've got this idea. What do you think about that? Or I'll ask kind of factual questions. So there's just a whole range of truly collaborative work that I'm able to do. And so I want to just give you a couple of examples of the kinds of questions that I've asked over this is what I did over the weekend. And this is actually, you guys failed to, by far and away the biggest AI news of the day, which is that we announced Gemini 3, our amazing new model this morning. And okay. Yeah.
And it was like, have a new car announcements come out every fall.
Yeah, we have a beautiful new car called Gemini 3. And so I was testing with Gemini 3 this weekend. It won't be a Notebook quite yet. It's going to come to Notebook soon, we hope. But inside a Notebook. And so a bunch of these answers are from Notebook. So I have written a proposal for this book. So I have a draft proposal. So I added that as a source. And so one of the things that I did was just say, take a look at my book proposal. I'm pretty happy with this draft, but what are some additional elements that I could add to the overall structure or scope of the book that would make it even more powerful? You can draw on information in the sources I've collected, but it could also be from your external knowledge of the period. So I was testing Gemini 3, whether it would give me some of that external knowledge, which it kind of did and kind of didn't. Now this is really annoying. It says, this is a tremendous proposal in its response, which is like the sycophancy problem where the model just is like, this is fantastic. So we're trying to tune that down because it does, I mean, maybe it is a tremendous proposal, who knows, but then it gives me like a bunch of really, really interesting ideas. Talks about like something we were talking about the other day, Dan, about the, and Peter, about the use of mercury in the mining process. So that's one example of like, hey, help me build on these ideas. How can I make this better? Asking the model to do that. Then another one that I think is really a good example of the kind of questions that you can ask now. Oh yeah, I know there's a big scene where one of the main characters, James Savage, dies. And so I'm trying to think about how I would tell that story. And so there's reference to Savage's death in like at least 15 of the sources in this notebook. Like it's scattered all over the place. It's in a bunch of books. And so I'm like, okay, give me like a detailed chronology of the final few days of Savage's life. So this is the kind of thing you do as an author all the time. You're like, okay, I got to tell this story, and I need to keep it clear in my head, like the sequence of events that are actually, in terms of the way that they're described in the historical archive, are actually scattered across like 15 different. But to write this story, I need to really know what the chronology is. And so I ask it to do this, and it does this amazing like background context of early 1852, talks about the squatter riots, then it talks about the final day, August 16th, 1852, and it goes through everything that happened on that day. And again, citations everywhere, so I can go back and figure out what the primary source is, like, is this account correct, and also find more information that maybe the model has kind of summarized. It talks about the aftermath, kind of work that would take literally a day of research to kind of like go through and organize and figure out. And now as an author, I'm able to be like, okay, now I know the chronology. This is great. I can really think about the higher level issue of how do I describe it? Like, what's the best way to make this come to life? So the kind of like grunt work of just organizing the facts of it, I can kind of outsource to the model, and I'm freed up to do the more creative work, to do the more narrative work, to do the more stylistic work of making it into a great story that people want to read. Then there's kind of an amazing, another kind of question. Oh yeah, so this was the kind of place where I felt like the model was getting into a very interesting new territory, which I think Gemini 3 seems to be much better at than 2.5 or the models before. So when you're writing a book, and I think this is true of writing a paper as well in college, is you're trying to figure out what you want to write or what you want your angle to be. Like, what is it that you are going to say about this material that is unique or has a kind of interesting take on it that other people don't have? You're constantly doing this work of like probing with an idea, like a hunch. You're like, is there something that I could do like on this particular topic that would be cool? Or what if I investigated this? Would there be enough material there? Or would that be original enough? Or would that be accurate? And so much of what research is and thinking and note-taking is on a project like this is sending out these little exploratory probes to figure out if there's something there. And what happens is, if you have curated a kind of high-value collection of sources that are relevant to the project that you have, if you've explained to the model what your overall vision is, if you've given it your proposal, if you've like put all of the context of both the historical information and your own perspective on it, AI using a tool like Notebook, you can do those kinds of probes and have the model kind of assess and give you feedback, again, much faster than you would normally do if you had to do it kind of manually. So this is the probe that I had. Is there some kind of riff about the way that Native Americans transform the acorn? So there's this whole thing about acorns and the history of acorns, which seems obscure, but I promise you in the final book it's going to be fascinating. Is there some kind of riff about the way that Native Americans transform the acorns into eatable food that parallels what the miners have to do to the gold? If that were a major topic for a chapter, how would we tell that story? So one thing that's pretty weird there, I imagine, to some people, is I've started using we in my conversation with the model. Like, hey, we have to tell this story. How would we do it? So I don't know. I didn't even kind of realize that I'd done that, but something is happening here that's kind of interesting. And so, yeah.
The pronouns are really weird in that section.
Yes, no, they are.
I talk about.
It's true. It gets confused here. This was interesting. I was actually really surprised that 3 did this. I don't. I want to go back and look at. So I have a custom prompt for this notebook where I kind of introduce myself. I'm like, I'm Stephen Johnson. I'm the author of these books. I'm writing a book about the gold rush. Help me kind of work on the idea. And I think it's the custom prompt that is throwing it off there, and I need to modify it to say, I am Stephen Johnson. You are NotebookLM. Like, let's get the relationship right here. And I think that's what's causing it to do that, because it wouldn't normally do that with your sources in that way. But yeah, it is funny.
It's funny. It's in the next paragraph says, if I were drafting this chapter,
Yeah.
not we.
Yeah. It's taking over the book. Yeah. There's a funny one. I also have a notebook called Thoughts, which is where I do all my thinking about the notebook, the product. And so all the sources there, the whole history of Notebook, all the blog posts about Notebook, everything we've ever done, it knows, the AI in that one knows Notebook intimately. And so at one point I had the exact same slip happen where, it said, it kind of referred to itself as me, kind of this identity problem. And I wrote back and I was like, oh, that's weird that you said I, when actually you were referring to me. And Notebook wrote back and said, yes, that's true. That was a mistake. However, because you are the co-founder of NotebookLM, so much of your vision is in this product. In a way, I feel that I am partly you, Stephen. And that was the point where I was like, okay, I'm just going to shut my mouth on it. It was a crazy moment. So anyway, that aside. So it goes through and talks about this, like the analogies between the technology of pulverization and the chemistry of leaching. And there are all these similarities between what the Native Americans had to do, the acorns to make them edible, and what the gold miners had to do to actually extract the gold from the quartz and things like that. And it talks about like energy density. And at some point it talks about how there's this really kind of horrible moment where the white settlers uncover these huge collections of acorns that have been abandoned by the Native Americans. And it's basically their food supply for the winter. They've captured all this energy and stored it. And so one way they can get energy to survive. And they can't find the Native Americans, but they burn all the acorns. And so at some point in the it talks about how like, it talks about, I ask about the night that they burned it, and it talks about how with that one act, they were burning, I think it says like megajoules of information or something like that. Like it did some calculation about like how much energy was being burned at that moment. And so I went through and I said, that's a great line. In a single night, the battalion was releasing megajoules of stored solar energy that the tribe had banked to survive the winter. So I'm like, walk me through the calculation there in a bit more detail. How do we know how much energy is stored in an acorn? And so it goes through, and I haven't fact checked this yet, so I don't know whether this is all right, but like it goes through and based on a lot of information that are my sources, calculates the amount of energy that was stored in an acorn. It calculates how many acorns would be in a bushel. It talks about how the sources refer to that there are 35 bushels there. And by the end of it, it does all this math and actually figures out that there were 147 gigajoules of energy that were released in this transaction. So big caveat here, I have not fact checked this yet, but I bring this up because it's the flow here is super interesting in terms of like what I'm doing with this product. So imagine where I was, 20 years ago with Devin Think, and I'm like, hey, here's a paragraph, paragraphs that kind of look like this paragraph. Yes, here are 5. And then I can kind of do something. I can't get back to the original text. I can't do citations. I can't do all these other things. But it was a breakthrough. It was amazing. It was fantastic. In this situation, I've assembled this incredible knowledge base. I'm able to like get to all those sources instantly and get to the original passages. I can read them. I can take notes. I can do all these things all in this one app. But I can also go through this like very high level intellectual work of, starting by saying like, hey, tell me about this one night. Give me the chronology of that one night so that I have it clear in my head so I can tell this story in a powerful way as an author. And then I can notice something interesting that the model said in that response that hadn't occurred to me about the amount of energy that's being burned in this like catastrophic event. And I can say, okay, wait, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that. Like, tell me more about that. And it can dive in and kind of like figure out, like validate it, expand the idea, let me go in new directions. And at some point I would probably do a deep research request here and be like, okay, actually I need to know everything that there is to know about the energy density about an acorn, which again, I realize sounds crazy, but it's gonna be really good in the and deep research would go find those sources and bring them in. And so I can go from like, hey, here's this little seedling of an idea, no pun intended, and turn it into like something that is kind of like profoundly like researched and empirically based and developed, or not. Maybe I will discover that it's a dead end, but I'll discover that it's a dead end faster and with more factuality than I would have in a week of research the kind of the old-fashioned way, and it was something that I could have never earlier tools like Devin think. So I have this feeling that from the beginning of the process of creating the book, how I come up with the idea, how I develop the idea, how I think about how to structure the idea, how I think about like what the contents are, how I fact check the idea, all the way to how I publish the ultimate collection of ideas in book or in notebook form, and what that new format looks like, where you can read the book but you can watch an audio video overview about it, or you can look at infographics based on each chapter, or you can create an interactive quiz, all those different new formats that are possible. Every step of that process is being rewritten by the underlying AI tools, and actually specifically by the way that I'm able to use NotebookLM now. And that just feels like right now a very exciting place to be. I'm very confident that I can write books, and I can write more. This is the controversial point. I can write more original books using these tools. I had this last thing I'll say, and then I want to make sure we have a bunch of time for questions. But I was driving. I have a son who's in a sophomore in college on the East Coast, and we were driving up to Parents' Weekend, and I was in the car with a friend of mine who's a novelist, who's very open to the idea of using AI and is not hostile about it, whatever. And I was talking about this process, and I said something like, "No, I'm convinced it will make me a more original writer." And she was like, "Look, Stephen, you have made everything else, but that seems like a category mistake. Like, how can you use this tool that is just the average of all human knowledge, kind of summed up? How can that make you more original? Like, by definition, if you're using the tool, you are like making it more like everybody else. You're making it more like the group mind of the world's knowledge and less like Stephen." And my counter to that is that I have all these things in my head as a writer that are not very original. A bunch of cliches in my head. I have a bunch of received ideas. I have a bunch of annoying ways of setting up a paragraph that I'm stuck in, that I've been doing for 25 years or 30 years. I have, kind of basic understandings of something like the gold rush that have kind of been watered down, that I don't really have any of the complexity and nuance that I really should have. And what I find this tool is able to help me do is get out of those unoriginal approaches, get out of my old habits of my old kind of cliches and the way that I phrase things, or the way that I imagine things or tell stories. And it pushes me, it lets me experiment and do those kind of probes, or like, what if we told it this way? What if we told it this way? What if we told it that way? And by driving that process, and this is kind of where we were talking about earlier about like, are you just asking questions and getting answers, or are you kind of driving an exploration that the AI is helping you execute? That feeling, that work of kind of like steering in new directions and getting answers on the fly dynamically at the speed of thought almost, feels like an enormous new superpower that I did not have just a year ago, really. Like even like the earlier versions of Notebook, and certainly not 5 years ago. Where that leads, like what it's like in 5 years, in 10 years, that's a whole other question. But right now it feels like a really tremendous opportunity, and incredibly fun, as you can probably tell, to help build it and to be a part of this has been just like an amazing weird swerve in my career that I really enjoyed. Okay, those are my thoughts. Questions and comments, your own experiences. Okay, we'll go back. It looks like some people have gone, so we'll go with you again, and then yeah.
Repeat the question so we hear it.
Okay, yeah.
Like broader strategy that you've spoken about your experience as a writer. This, there's a bankers who love them, but do you see them as moving into individual verticals, or do you think this is a future of this whole process?
Yeah, great question. The question is like, where does Notebook fit in kind of Google's larger strategy, and how closely aligned is it with specific verticals? And yeah, it's how it's being used in terms of the usage. We have a lot of student and researcher usage right now. So researcher, scholar, student is a significant portion of us, but it turns out to have all these like general purpose uses. It has a lot of like serious enterprise use, and so one of the things when it kind of took off last fall, we created kind of in the workspace suite, and then in the cloud enterprise suite over there for people who are have really high security documents that they need to have on their own servers, stuff like that. They effectively kind of rebuilt NotebookLM to work in that kind of environment. So we think that is a big opportunity. We're still not particularly, we don't have the adoption yet in those more kind of corporate environments that we do in the classroom or in academia. But I think around Google, there's a lot of sense that this kind of structure for an application, the way that it uses AI is really valuable. But we're also really committed to like expanding the student use case stuff. So there's a wonderful team called LearnX at Google, and we're working closely with them to add kind of student-facing features like flashcards and quizzes were the first things that they actually developed. So we're trying to, like, our biggest problem as a product right now is that like there are just too many things we want to do. Number one problem is just like we have a limited number of resources, and like how do we decide what to prioritize? Like that's been the biggest challenge. Okay, yeah.
So you had an interesting point earlier on the like sort of originality notion. So for yourself, you're like an established author, you have like a foundation, you can grow using these tools. Do you worry about like the notion of like linguistic convergence or like even like thought form convergence of like young students or children who are now growing up using these tools, like patterns of thought kind of influence, or like I guess lack of like having their critical thinking skills reduced, or like even just in writing style being pushed towards the same sort of like linguistic area?
Yeah, Marco and I were talking about this yesterday, actually. Great question. The question is, I grew up, I mean, I literally can remember typing on a electric typewriter before I switched over to a word processor. Like that's how old I am. So a whole long period of time where I did not have any tools like this, and certainly not anything resembling these advanced tools like Notebook and with language models. And so I built a whole foundation of how I write and how I think that is kind of like was kind of free of that stuff. So then the question is it great news for me dropping down with all that experience with these amazing tools and able to kind of superpower my work with these, or supercharge my work with these new powers? But for someone who is learning to write for the first time, is there an issue? And I think one of those places where the source grounding kind of context curation piece is so important. So there's such a fundamental difference between working with a model that is just the general purpose model, and you're like, I need help with this, please write this paper for me, or help me explore this idea based on the average kind of human correct answer to the problem, or a way of writing this sentence, or things like that. But if you think of your relationship to AI as about like, what I want to do is curate the right context here that fits my vision, or my kind of what I'm trying to put out in the world, or what I'm trying to learn, or what I'm trying to do, or here are the writers that I admire, and I'd like to put their work into the notebook, and I would like to kind of like learn how to write the way that they are writing, so that I can build my own stuff. That if you make that conscious step of like, I need to curate the knowledge I want to do and personalize it, then I think you don't have the problem. I think then you have, then you're actually creating, every AI is slightly different. Every AI is like uniquely customized for like the thinker, the user. And I think that's one of the ways in which I think hopefully these tools will be used in the classroom. Is like every classroom will give you kind of a unique AI based on the reading and the teaching and everything else in that class. And while you're in that class and using the notebook for that class, you will have a very different sensibility and worldview and style than you will in your other class. And so as long as you're exposed to lots of those different styles, both formal and kind of intellectual, I think actually there's an argument, because you have this amazing tool, because you have all these resources, because you're able to, ask all these questions, get answers, because you effectively have a 24 tutor customized to your learning style, like available to you. Like you add all that together, and that's probably a net positive. But if the future of learning is people just going to a vanilla like chatbot and relying just on that without any of that curation and source grounding and kind of the desire to like personalize or to make it richer and more nuanced, then I would be more worried about that scenario. Yes.
Building notebook LM, like require a lot of outside the box thinking. I'm curious how you kind of worked with Google to that and how they supported this kind of project. And then second, like what your agency over the product now looks like.
Yeah. I'm not sure I know the answer to the last one. So the question is like, what kind of process did we use in developing the kind of ideas, the kind of outside the box ideas, and how did that process work inside of Google? How did they support me with that? And then what is my agency over the product today now that we have, almost 100 people on the team? So I think there was an interesting thing that we did in the early days where we kind of like effectively the kind of informal role that I had was kind of like lead user. And so there was this early in those first prototypes you saw there in the fall of 2022. It was pretty much the exercise was, what would Stephen want? Like, let's just work with this. Let's just think of like user one. Like, we just have one person here. We did very little. We did no research in the early days. Like a couple of months in, we started to do research, but mostly we were just like, we've got Stephen here. We have an actual writer in the house. And let's just like follow his lead. And so I was like, oh, I've always wanted to wanted to like select the text and do these things. And so we just kind of like did that. And that was a really quick way to get to a working prototype. And there was kind of I think it enabled us to move much faster than we would have otherwise if we've been like, we don't really know what we want. So we have to do like, 5 rounds of user research to figure out what a wide range of people, and then we have to figure out what vertical we're talking. We're just like, no, we're just going to target Steve. And the bet was that there was some my user needs that would be more universally relevant to people, and that turned out to be generally true. But I suppose that's a risk you take with that approach. But it's a really great early stage prototyping approach. And then once we realized we had something interesting, and once we realized, particularly post ChatGPT, that like, native AI products were a valuable thing for Google to have. Then we did tons of research, and we spent all this time talking to different groups, and it became much less about me. Or like also, I'm like, I would have never built audio overviews. Like, I don't really listen to podcasts, so like that was kind of the best thing we ever did on some level. And like, it would have, if they would just been listening to me, it would have never gotten built. Today, now it's it's an interesting thing if you go through this process, because once you get to a certain size, we are very we're very like nimble. We're shipping new features at an incredible rate right now, and it's a very creative team. But there's so much of my job now is kind of building consensus, right? So you have to, which is something that I, as a writer, I spent most of my career not doing. Like, what the beautiful thing about being a writer is you just sit down to work and you do whatever you want, pretty much for like 2 years, and then eventually you persuade your editor that it's good, and then eventually maybe you persuade the reviewers that what you've written is good. But mostly you do just listen to your own head and work. You get to a team size of the kind that we have now, there's just a lot of work of like, okay, I know to get this feature on the roadmap, I have to get kind of buy-in from this person and from this person and from this person. And sometimes it's like, oh, I didn't even realize I needed to get buy-in from this other person too. And it's maybe my least favorite part of the job now, if I'm being honest. But I realize that it's inevitable. Like, that is it's the price you pay to continue to influence the how we use AI on the scale that Google gives us, is just an amazing thing. So it's a trade-off I happily make, but it's complicated.
Wrote books by yourself, but you also wrote books with co-authors. So how do you form consensus with them? And do they help you have creativity in the way that NotebookLM does?
Yeah.
Before you do that, can you switch to my slide?
So it's I haven't done a lot of co-authoring, but the thing that's closest to it is that I made a bunch of TV shows. like the PBS documentaries. And that was the thing. And I did a couple of startups, so there was a little taste of that in there. But it's the what did I grab? That when we were making the documentaries. Okay, so demanding there. There we go. Okay, good. So that was when I was making we did a couple of PBS, BBC documentaries based on the books. And in a way, one of those books, How We Got to Now, was kind of, in a sense, co-authored because I wrote it off of the shows. And so the shows were kind of created with a bunch of people, and then I kind of wrote the book. So it felt very collaborative. And that was a situation where you had like producers, co-writers for the episodes, the directors of the episodes, and the studio heads, which is the whole thing I had, so you have a whole vision, you get everybody on board, and then the studio heads come in and we're like, yes, that's good, but like, can you turn all the characters into witches, whatever, like they get their own ideas. And so that was the closest thing to this project, but I think those were a little bit easier because I was the host of the show. It was kind of going to be based on my book, and so there was a little bit of like centrality to me. Whereas now with Notebook, like, it's a true collective. Like I like more of a public face for it. But besides that, like, so many of the ideas came from other people, and so I've kind of like learned how to. There's something like this which feels like my baby in its infancy. There is this kind of active surrender you have to do where you're just like, you know what? So many other people have so many amazing ideas are going to advance this thing, and my ideas are just going to be a small part of it from now on. And that took a little bit of adjusting. But now I'm just so constantly like amazed at all the things that are being created that I would have never thought of, that I'm happy with it. Any other last?
We're going to close this.
Hey, thanks, everyone.